In the history of warfare, victory is usually measured by what you destroy. You bomb the enemy's factories, you sink their ships, you burn their airfields. Destruction is the currency of success. But on the afternoon of September 7th, 1940, the definition of victory was turned upside down. On this day, nearly 1,000 German aircraft darkened the skies over southern England. Their target was not a military base. It was not a radar station. It was the largest metropolis on Earth, London. As the first bombs whistled down onto the docks of the East End, igniting a firestorm that would burn for weeks, the world watched in horror. They saw civilians dying. They saw a great empire crumbling. They saw the apparent triumph of Nazi terror. But inside the deepest bunkers of the Royal Air Force, the commanders watching the radar screens didn't feel horror. They felt something that no one dared to whisper aloud: relief. Because they knew a secret that Hitler did not. They knew that by attacking London, the Luftwaffe had just committed a strategic suicide. For the past 2 weeks, the RAF had been systematically strangled. They were hours, literally hours, away from total collapse. If the Germans had continued their previous strategy for just 3 more days, the British air defense would have ceased to exist. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, would have launched. The swastika would likely be flying over Whitehall. Why did the most efficient military machine in history suddenly stop doing the one thing that was working? Why did they switch targets at the critical moment? The answer involves a lost pilot, a jettisoned bomb load, a dictator's fragile ego, and a catastrophic miscalculation that saved the free world. To understand the magnitude of Hitler's mistake, we must first understand the brutal mathematics of August 1940. The Battle of Britain was not a fight over territory, it was a fight for air superiority. Germany had the numbers. The Luftwaffe, led by the flamboyant Hermann Göring, had over 2,500 serviceable aircraft. The RAF Fighter Command, led by the stoic Hugh Dowding, had fewer than 700. But Dowding had an ace up his sleeve: the Dowding system, a complex integrated network of radar towers known as chain home, observer corps, and telephone lines that allowed the British to see the enemy coming. For the first month of the battle, the Germans attacked shipping in the Channel. It was a probing phase, but in August the strategy shifted. Directive number 17, issued by Hitler. The order was clear: the British Air Force must be eliminated. The German plan was sound, it was ruthless, and it was executed by Luftwaffe II under Field Marshal Kesselring. The target list was specific: the sector stations: Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, North Weald. These weren't just parking lots for planes, they were the nerve centers of the defense. If you knocked out the sector stations, the radar information couldn't get to the pilots. The Dowding system would be blind. From August 24th to September 6th, the Luftwaffe pounded these airfields with relentless precision. It is impossible to overstate how critical this period was. We call it the fortnight. On August 30th, during a massive raid on Biggin Hill, the operations room received a direct hit. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAFs, kept plotting raids until the glass shattered around them and the telephone lines were cut. On August 31st, Debden Airfield was bombed, then Hornchurch, then Biggin Hill again. The physical damage was bad, but the human cost was catastrophic. In this 2-week period, the RAF lost 295 fighters, but more importantly,
They lost 103 pilots killed and 128 seriously wounded. You can build a Spitfire in a few days. It takes a year to train a pilot. The RAF was bleeding out. The British replacement system had collapsed. New pilots were arriving at squadrons with less than 10 hours of flight time on a Spitfire. They were fodder. Most died on their first sortie. Air Vice Admiral Keith Park, commanding the Vital 11 Group, wrote to Dowding, "The enemy is smashing our house brick by brick. We are falling apart." However, the Germans were also straining. To truly understand why the next phase, the target switch, was so fatal, we have to look inside the cockpit of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. Technically, the German Bf-109 and the British Spitfire were evenly matched. The 109 could climb faster, the Spitfire could turn tighter. It was a duel of equals, but the Germans had a fatal flaw: fuel. The Bf-109 had a range of only about 400 miles. Flying from France to the British coast, fighting for 10 minutes and flying back was their absolute limit. When attacking the RAF airfields in Kent and Sussex, the German pilots had about 20 minutes of combat fuel. It was tight, but manageable. But attacking London? That was a different story. German ace Adolf Hitler later complained that his pilots were fighting with one eye on the enemy and one eye on the fuel gauge. By shifting the target to London later in the battle, Hitler would force his fighters to fly an extra 50 miles inland. That meant 10 minutes less fighting time. It meant that when the RAF Spitfires attacked, the German escorts often couldn't stay to fight. They had to turn back or ditch in the Channel. This geographical reality made the airfields the only logical target. Furthermore, let's look at the attrition math that Dowding was obsessing over. The U.S. ambassador to the U.K., Joseph Kennedy, was sending telegrams back to Roosevelt saying, "England is finished. It's only a matter of weeks." Kennedy was looking at the number of planes, but he missed the crucial detail. When a German pilot was shot down over England, he was captured. He was gone from the war. When a British pilot was shot down over England, if he survived, he parachuted into a potato field, had a cup of tea, and was back in a new plane by dinner time. The RAF could recycle their most precious resource, their men. The Germans could not. As long as the fight remained over British soil, the math favored the defender, unless the defender had nowhere to land. That is why the airfields were the key. Destroy the nest, and the birds have nowhere to rest.
The German generals knew this. Kesselring knew this. They were grinding the RAF down. But history often turns on grand decisions made by great men, and sometimes it turns on a navigational error made by a tired 22-year-old. The night of August 24th, 1940, a flight of German Heinkel 111 bombers is assigned to attack the oil storage tanks at Thameshaven and an aircraft factory in Rochester. Military targets. But navigation in 1940 was primitive. It relied on radio beams, dead reckoning, and visual landmarks. One bomber crew gets lost, hopelessly lost. They are drifting west, pushed by a tailwind they didn't account for. They believe they are over the open countryside of Kent. They are under strict orders. Do not bomb London. Hitler had personally forbidden it. He believed that if he spared London, the British might still sue for peace. He wanted to break their military, not their society. But the crew of this lost Heinkel is low on fuel. They need to lighten the load to make it back to France. They toggle the release switch. Below them, through the gaps in the clouds, is not the countryside. It is the dense, sleeping heart of London. Cripplegate, the city, the East End.
The bombs exploded in central London for the first time in the war. It was a pinprick in terms of military damage. A few buildings destroyed, some civilians killed. Tragic, yes, but militarily insignificant. However, the political explosion was nuclear. Churchill did not know this was an accident. He assumed the gloves were off. Churchill had been waiting for this. He knew that Britain couldn't win a purely defensive war. He needed to provoke Hitler. He needed to drag the war into a different arena, one where British resolve could match German firepower. The very next morning, Churchill ordered the RAF Bomber Command to prepare for a retaliation raid. The target? Berlin. It was a suicide mission in terms of distance. The RAF Hampden and Wellington bombers were pushing their range to the limit. They carried tiny bomb loads compared to the Germans. But the target wasn't a factory. The target was the German ego. The RAF raid on Berlin on the night of August 25th did almost no physical damage. They destroyed a summer house in a garden. They killed no one. But they shattered a promise. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously boasted to the German people, "No enemy plane will fly over the Reich territory. If they do, you can call me Meyer." Well, the sirens were wailing in Berlin. The impossible had happened. Adolf Hitler was humiliated. For dictators, humiliation is more dangerous than an army. His entire image was built on invincibility and the protection of the German Volk. Churchill had slapped him in the face. In the days that followed, the RAF raided Berlin again and again. On September 4th, Hitler took to the stage at the Sportpalast in Berlin. The crowd was frenzied. Abandoning his prepared notes, Hitler screamed his new strategy to the world. "When the British Air Force drops 2 or 3 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, then we will in one night drop 150, 230, 300, or 400,000 kilograms. If they declare that they will attack our cities, then we will wipe their cities out." This was the moment. The fatal switch. Kesselring, commanding the air fleet, supported the idea. He believed the RAF was already finished. He thought attacking London would draw out the last few British fighters into a final decisive battle where they could be destroyed. General Hugo Sperle, commanding Luftwaffe 3, disagreed. He argued that the RAF was still dangerous and that the airfields must remain the priority. Hitler sided with Kesselring and his own rage. The order went out. Stop hitting the airfields. Target London. It was a decision born of emotion, not strategy. Hitler wanted to break the will of the British people. He believed that if he leveled London, Churchill would be forced to surrender. He forgot one thing. Terror bombing has never, in the history of warfare, caused a population to revolt against its own government. It only makes them harder.
September 7th, 1940. The weather was perfect. High above the Channel, over 300 bombers and 600 fighters formed a phalanx of steel 2 miles wide. On the ground, at the RAF sector stations like Biggin Hill, the ground crews were bracing for the end. They were running out of spare parts. The runways were cratered. The phone lines were dead. They knew they couldn't survive another day of pounding. But then,
something strange happened. The German formation crossed the coast and kept going. They didn't bank towards the airfields. They flew straight over the battered runways of Biggin Hill. They ignored the radar masts at Dover. They were heading for the Thames. Keith Park watched the plot table. He realized the target was London. His heart must have broken for the civilians in the capital, but professionally, he knew he had just been given a lifeline. For the first time in 2 weeks, his airfields were not under attack. While London began to burn, the RAF began to breathe. While Hitler fumed and Kesselring plotted, the people of London were the ones paying the price. We often talk about the Blitz spirit, but we must not romanticize the horror. When the switch happened on September 7th, London's defenses were woefully unprepared. On that first night, Black Saturday, the fire brigade faced 9 massive conflagrations and 1,000 smaller fires. The Surrey commercial docks were a wall of flame so bright that you could read a newspaper in the street at midnight 5 miles away. But inside the RAF, another war was being fought, a political one, and Hitler's mistake accidentally resolved it. While Keith Park was defending the South with his system, his rival, Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory in the North, was criticizing him. Mallory argued for the big wing theory, assembling 3, 4, or 5 squadrons into a massive formation to smash the enemy. Park argued he didn't have time to assemble big wings. He had to intercept quickly to protect the airfields. Hitler's switch to London changed the geometry of the battle. Because the Germans were now flying deeper inland to reach London, they gave the RAF more time to form up. Suddenly, Mallory's big wings became viable. The extra time allowed the RAF to mass their forces. So when Hitler switched targets, he didn't just save the airfields. He accidentally validated the tactic that would destroy his own bomber fleets. He gave the RAF the gift of time. This is the part of the Battle of Britain that is often overlooked. During the Blitz on London, the RAF didn't just fight, they rebuilt. Every night that London was bombed was a night that an RAF airfield was not. Runways were repaved, comm systems were rewired, new pilots arrived and, crucially, were given a few days of training without being shot at on takeoff. The brick-by-brick destruction of the fighter command had stopped.
The Germans believed their own propaganda. They thought the RAF was down to its last 50 Spitfires. They thought the attacks on London would draw out these last few survivors to be swatted away like flies. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched an all-out assault on London to finish the job. They expected a funeral procession. They walked into a buzzsaw. Because of the respite given by the switch to London, the RAF was not only operational, it was at full strength. Keith Park was able to assemble his squadrons into wings. When the German bombers arrived over London, they weren't met by a handful of stragglers. They were met by 300 RAF fighters. It was a shock to the German system. One German pilot famously exclaimed over the radio, "Here come those last 50 Spitfires again." The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was clear. The Luftwaffe lost 60 aircraft that day. The RAF lost 26. But the psychological defeat was total. Winston Churchill was present at the Uxbridge bunker that day. As the battle raged, he asked Air Vice Marshal Park, "What reserves do we have?" Park replied, "There are none. Every single plane was in the sky. It was an all-in gamble. And because the airfields had been repaired, because the system was working again, the gamble paid off." 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler issued a new directive. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The invasion was off. Germany had lost the Battle of Britain. Military historians have debated the what-ifs of World War II for decades, but few are as clear-cut as this. If that stray Heinkel had not bombed London, if Churchill had not ordered the Berlin raid, if Hitler had kept his temper and listened to Spörler instead of Kesselring, if the Luftwaffe had continued hammering the sector stations for just one more week, the RAF would have been pushed north of the Thames. The invasion fleet would have crossed the Channel under a German air umbrella. The Royal Navy, without air cover, would have been vulnerable to Stuka dive bombers. Britain likely would have fallen. The impact of this mistake reverberated all the way to the White House. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was facing an election. He wanted to help Britain, but he couldn't back a loser. The prevailing wisdom in the U.S. military was that Britain would fall by October. If Hitler had destroyed the RAF airfields, the invasion would have likely succeeded, and the U.S. would have retreated into Fortress America. Isolationism would have won. But the miracle of September changed the narrative. American journalists like Edward R. Murrow were reporting live from the burning rooftops of London. They didn't report defeat, they reported resistance. The sight of London burning but standing, and the RAF winning the skies on September 15th, proved to FDR that Britain could survive. This led directly to the Lend-Lease Agreement. Hitler's decision to bomb London didn't just lose him the Battle of Britain. It was the catalyst that eventually brought the industrial might of the United States into the war against him. In the end, the Battle of Britain was won by the courage of the few, the pilots who flew the planes, but it was also won by the mistake of the one. Adolf Hitler's decision to switch targets was the turning point. It was the moment his hubris finally outweighed his strategy. He chose to break a city rather than break an air force, and in doing so, he broke his own chance of winning the war. The Battle of Britain was the first major defeat for Nazi Germany, but it wasn't the last time Hitler's ego would interfere with military logic. Click here to watch our video on Stalingrad, the city that broke the Wehrmacht, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world.